Hello and welcome to week 4. This week we're going to be focusing on theoretical perspectives on oral language development. So oral language is going to be our main focus. The agenda for this week is we're going to be looking at stages of oral language development. We're going to look at areas of oral language knowledge. We're going to look at oral language from a diverse child's perspective and highlight some things to notice in regards to diverse children. We're going to look at interaction patterns, and then we're going to focus on some of the things that you can do as teachers in your classrooms. We're going to highlight avoiding the deficit thinking model in terms of language development, and then I'm going to recommend a video entitled Birth of a Word, which is pretty cool to watch, and highlight some aspects of emergent literacy just because you might need this for your focal child observations in terms of theories that you can be connecting to what you're observing in your focal child. Lastly, we're going to remind you of what the homework is for this week, and that will be our closing. So before we start, I wanted to talk a little bit about the focal child observations because this week we're going to begin submitting them. So in your auto book, and it's going to be on page 27 for the 2019 version and on page 41 for the 2015 version. So in those pages in that book, chapter 3 begins with a vignette. And in the vignette, Eric and his mom notice a dog and have a conversation about it. So when you read the vignette, the whole explanation of what is happening could go under your note-taking column. And we're using the same form for observations that we've been using all along, with the 3 columns of note-taking, note-making, and learning theories. And so the vignette that you're looking at, you would probably write it as is in the note-taking column because it's an objective and detailed description of the events that occurred. So the vignette itself would go on the first column in the note-taking column. And then if you continue reading on chapter 3, Eric's mom highlights some things that she noticed in him. Like, for example, she sees that he's able to understand her initial message to him and comprehend it. She noticed that he can focus on the unfolding event because he comprehended her initial message. And then she noticed that he can express his thoughts clearly. So those are some inferences and interpretations that could go on note-making column. And alongside with others that you're making of what you observed. But this will give you an example of what would go in the first column and in the second column. And in the third column in learning theories, if we wanted to connect this to the theory, we could say that he is on his way of developing an effective oral language skills. But we could also talk about his expressive language, his receptive language, words that he knows, so taking into account the different aspects, the different technical aspects of language, and highlighting what we can observe of his utterances and his communication with his mom. So this is a really good example of an observation that you could have made of your focal child and what would go in the note-taking column versus the note-making versus the learning theory. Although the example that we did in the first week was pretty good, and the observations that you did of the child talking on the phone with her dad from that video were really good ones. So that is also an example of what your focal child observations could be looking like. Okay, so let's get into this week's topic. The first topic is the theoretical perspectives or stages of oral language development. And in your chapter, in your auto book, in the 2019 version, the recent version, on page 28, there's a table 3.1, that has this in a really concise way presented and summarized for you. So But let's go through these stages really quickly. The first stage is a cooing stage, where the child is making sounds, but these sounds are extended vowel sounds, more so than consonants. So you'll see that around 6 weeks of age, the child says things like ah, 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 right? Or oh, oh, oh. It starts with the vowels first. And there's just random noises that indicate that the child is listening these noises and being able to reproduce them, and is sort of playing with sounds. The second stage is babbling, and occurs around 4 to 6 months, and it's when the child is able to repeat consonant and vowel sounds, so paired together, like da 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 da, or ma 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 ma, or pa 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 pa, which are typically the first ones that that the children say. But then when those repetitions of consonant and vowels you can start hearing that they have an intonation or a rhythm that mimics the intonation or the rhythm of a regular adult's speech. Then we're talking about echolalia that occurs between 8 and 10 months. And it's just that same babbling of repeating the vowels and the consonants, but with this intonation and rhythm that mimics the one that adults make when they speak. The third stage is the one-word stage. And in this one-word stage, the children can begin, talking about or just enunciating a word or uttering a word to say milk or water or dada or mama, just one word, but that is a distinguishable word, right? Also, in this one-word stage, invented word-like units are used or are created by the child. So when the child calls their blanket night-night, because they associate it with they associate it with the time when they go to sleep, and they grab the blanket and they get ready for sleeping, and so they call the blanket night-night. And it's an invented word for an object that is not called that. So that's the inventive process. So the word night-night or the word night is a word that exists, but the blanket is not necessarily called night, it's called a blanket. So the invented is sort of like a word-like unit that the child is giving to a particular object. Around 1 year, more conventional words that resemble adult-like pronunciation and meaning are used to communicate, and that's when they start, saying "wah-wah" for water, or are able to pronounce the full word of water for the object of water, and so on. The fourth stage is the telegraphic stage. And the telegraphic stage consists of stringing words together in a sentence-like segment. And this happens around the 2-year mark, when children become toddlers. And this is telegraphic because the utterances don't include words with conjunctions or articles or prepositions or word endings. So the child can say me water that conveys a meaning and that the parent will understand, but really what he's trying to say is, I'm thirsty, I want water. But he can only say me water, right? So it's a telegraphic way of communicating that has a meaning, that conveys a meaning, but it's not a full structured sentence. The beginning of oral fluency, which is the fifth and last stage of this sort of beginning oral development or early emergent oral development, occurs between 3 and 4 years of age, where there's fluency in the home language, so the language that the child has been listening to at home, there's fluency in that language, and the child is able to ask questions. The vocabulary expands and becomes a little more complex, and the use of language is much more adult-like, and the child is able to enunciate and utter full sentences when they speak to others. So areas of oral language knowledge. In this one, there's another table on page 29, table 3.2, which has a really good summary of the overall 5 areas of language knowledge, or areas of aspects of technical language that we've been talking about so far. So phonetic knowledge is associated with knowing the sounds that are related to the symbols. So this would be, for example, the child knowing the letters of the alphabet and knowing what sound is related to each of the letters of the alphabet. Semantic knowledge has to do with vocabulary and with knowing the meanings of the words. So not just knowing that I can say and I can pronounce the word dog, but I actually know what that word means, and I can see an actual dog and identify it by its name, right? So it has to do with vocabulary, but not just how many words can you say, but really knowing the meaning behind the words that you're saying. Syntactic knowledge has to do with grammar, and it has to do with knowing the rules of the language system that you're speaking, and knowing that you say, for example, the house is big versus saying the biggest house, right? So when you have, there's certain rules that you know, and that have an implicit guidance of where you are going to put the noun versus the verb versus the article in a sentence, right? So that's the third one. The fourth area of knowledge in terms of oral language is morphemic knowledge. And morphemic knowledge is the knowledge of how words can be changed, and is the knowledge of the word structure, how words are actually structured. And it's the knowledge that is going to allow you to know that if you have a prefix before in a word, and you take that prefix out of the word, that word continues to hold meaning. And because of that, we can add aspects or parts of letters or combinations of letters to words, or take combinations of letters out of words, and the word, the main root word, is going to maintain its meaning. But we can change that meaning by altering the prefix or the suffix of the words. We can also, morphemic knowledge also has to do with types of words, and words that are verbs versus verbs that are nouns, or if they're used in a certain way, maybe a word that is a noun could be used as a verb, and so on. So it has to do with the structure of words, but also how words are used because of sort of the category that they belong to. Pragmatic knowledge has to do with the use of language in different settings. So if I'm a child and I am experimenting with oral language, and maybe I am a child from a different cultural background, and I have acquired some slang language, I know that it's appropriate to use this language in the playground. But maybe I go and use the same language at school with a teacher, and the teacher says something like, oh no, we don't use that word here. And that context that is given to the child of where it's appropriate to use a word versus where it's not gives the child that pragmatic knowledge that's very much culturally embedded. So the child being from a different country might not be aware of, or for a different cultural background, might not be aware of what the pragmatic knowledge or the pragmatic use of a word is in this particular context. So the pragmatic knowledge is knowing that, being aware of where it's appropriate to use certain words, versus where it's not appropriate. Metalinguistic knowledge is about knowing what you know. And this is about knowing, for example, in the pragmatic knowledge, the child might know this slang language, right? And they might be able to use that adequately in the playground. But when they use it in the classroom and the teacher is telling them, no, this is not the context where we use it, then the child realizes that they don't really know when it's appropriate to use this language or not, right? So being aware of what you know and what you don't know is going to give you that metalinguistic knowledge. And for you as a teacher to be able to identify if the child is aware of that is going to be important, because in order to have metalinguistic knowledge, you need to be using higher order thinking skills. So the cognitive skills that are involved in a metalinguistic knowledge process are going to be higher cognitive skills. Okay, so let me show you this. This is the table that is in your book on page 9 that has this, what we just talked about, summarized in a very succinct and clear way. So this would be a really good table to highlight, to have with you when you're trying to connect theory to the observations of your focal children. Okay, so let's look at this quote. This quote comes from Soto Manning and Martel's book on page 60. They say, young children who are socialized into pragmatic rules that differ from what counts as appropriate in the U.S. or in U.S. schools and schooling are often disadvantaged by teachers' expectations that young children would understand how indirectness may specify politeness, how questions may mean commands, and how some questions are not meant to be answered. So think about this, and think about a child that is coming into your classroom from a different cultural background, that might even speak a different language than English. And how is that child to be socialized and to understand this pragmatic knowledge of language that comes with these unspoken rules that are based in our cultural context in which we are embedded, in which U.S. schools are embedded here in this country? And then how would that child be able to recognize what are those unspoken rules? Why do we have to look someone in the eyes when we speak to them as a sign of politeness, right? When maybe in their culture, looking at someone in the eyes is a sign of defiance and it's not respectful. And then you look down or look away because you don't want to seem defiant and disrespectful. Whereas the teacher might be expecting the child to look at her in the eyes, because that is not only a sign of respect, but it's a sign that they're listening to what she's saying. So another one that's really common is these questions that may mean commands, because teachers in the U.S. tend to ask children to do things through not necessarily telling them, but asking them. And for example, when you ask a child and you say, can you please sit down? That is a question, right? It's not a command. It's a question that begins with can, and can you do this? And the answer to that could be, yes, I can sit down. But you don't actually sit, because she's not telling you to sit down, right? Whereas if we're embedded in this cultural context, we know that when the teacher is saying, can you please sit down, what she really means is sit down. Sit down now, right? So, and If you say sit down now, that is a command that is really straightforward, that a child that is listening to your words verbatim and does not have the cultural context around it will know exactly what you want them to do, which is to sit. But if the command comes disguised in a question, then it's not really clear if you want me to sit down or if you want me to tell you if it's possible for me to sit down. So the ways that in which we communicate with children, we need to, as teachers, be very aware of what we're doing, how we're using language, and how we are sharing language with the children, particularly if we know that the children are coming from a different cultural background than our own. And Sotomayor and Martero do a really good job at sort of raising that flag for us. Okay, so interaction patterns. This is coming from Otto's book, and she talks about different things that we can do to facilitate and help communication when we're talking to children, and also help and support oral language development. So help scaffold it so that it continues to develop. So one of the things that she says is to use a shared reference and to make eye contact, right? And again, going back to what we just talked about, the question here posed, are these interaction patterns universal, is because sometimes we need to be careful of using these interaction patterns because we might be thinking, by using this, I'm going to support oral language development. And really, by using them, I'm confusing the child because the cultural context and the background of the child is different from the typical U.S. born, U.S. native child that is going to come to our classrooms if the child has a different cultural background, right? So, but these tend to work in the sense that once a child has comprehended what the cultural background is, then these interaction patterns can help the child develop their oral language. So shared reference and eye contact is to know what we're talking about. That's the shared reference, and to make eye contact to engage the student in the conversation. Oral communication loops is basically turn taking and teaching the child that when one person is speaking, the other one is listening, and then they swap roles. And so now the communicator is listening and the listener now is communicating or speaking. Verbal mapping is describing. It has to do with everything you say, you describe, you elaborate, you give a lot of details so the child can, one, understand what you're trying to say, but also two, is listening to a lot of words that are probably going to contribute to augmenting his or her vocabulary, which is one of your goals. Child-directed speech is another way to interact with children to help promote or scaffold their oral language development, and it has to do with using grammar that is less complex than what you would typically use or what you would use with an adult. Use intonation that's really expressive, that it's a little bit exaggerated. Use general vocabulary, so don't include very complex words, and if you are including those words, make sure that you define them and that you explain what those words mean. Slow your pace when you speak, and that helps the child really understand what the utterances are. And then focus on an immediate context, or have the context handy so that the child knows exactly what is it that we're talking about. The linguistic scaffolding can happen as well as a support for oral language development. It has to do with asking questions, with expanding what the child said, expanding on it, repeating what the child said and repeating our words as well. And then mediation is a simplification of the learning task. So we mediate by making the learning task a little less advanced or a little less complicated. We simplify it so that the child is able to comprehend the message. And then one example is when you're reading a book, you're changing the words in the book so that they are at the vocabulary level of the children that you're working with. So what are some of the things that teachers can do? So one of the things that we can do is to highlight key components of these social interactions that happen every day. We can engage children as a partner in communication when we're speaking to them and with them. And then we can use effective interaction pattern strategies to keep the child engaged, like the ones that we talked about before. So we can use those interaction pattern strategies, and we're going to help the child continue to be engaged, and we're going to also be supporting their oral language development. We can also foster storying in our classrooms, and that has to do with listening and telling stories from Indigenous or West African or African American or Japanese cultures or Latinx or Hispanic cultures, and letting children be the authors of their own stories. That is going to be really important. Story acting is another strategy. And interviewing family members, asking questions, playing games like freeze, and then in circle time discussing and making characters for stories and acting out the stories. Vivian Gussing-Paley has a collection of books that she wrote when she was a kindergarten teacher and after she had retired from that, in which one of the ways in which she would encourage or promote literacy and language development for her students was through acting out stories. So the children would come to her, they would dictate, if they didn't know how to write yet, they would dictate the story to her. They would decide who would be the main characters, which child would play which character, and then they would act these stories out. And it was a really innovative way for her in her curriculum, and it all revolved around it, for the children to acquire these emergent literacy skills. So these are just some examples of strategies that you can use in your classroom to promote. But when we're talking about different cultural backgrounds and telling stories that are dear and near to children's histories, these are some examples of books that you could use to help children create their own stories from their own backgrounds. They can also, as we said in the slide before, interview their relatives, their grandparents, and ask them questions, and through those answers create their own stories that have to do with their cultural backgrounds and their lived experiences. So what is another thing that teachers can do is allow children to play. So play is going to be the way in which children are going to learn, particularly young children. So we have this quote that play is children's work, and we know that through having children decide, through choice time, decide what they want to do, which area they want to go to, what material they want to interact with, have them have that be their play/work time, in which they can really explore the world and learn through playing. In Jessica Martel's classroom, they call it nuestro tiempo. It's our time, right? That's the literal translation of that is our time. It's our time to learn. It's our time to play. It's our time to engage with the world. It's the learning through play time. Okay, here are some examples of children playing, materials that can be used, materials that are open-ended, examples of things that children have used, and examples of children using the material to learn through direct exploration of materials and direct interaction with materials and with classmates, with peers. Okay, another thing that teachers can do is foster critical conversations with students. And you can talk about friendships, about fairness, about fantasy. And you can do this in morning meetings. You can do it through children's literature, the storybooks that you read to children. You can do it through authentic writing experiences. And this should be happening all day long. So not just during the ELA period of your class, but of your day, but throughout the entire day. Okay, we talked a little bit about this last week, but this also is something that teachers can do, is bring families into the classroom and have them tell us their authentic experience from their particular cultural background, and spend time with families outside of school. So have families, not only families come in, but us meaning teachers, go into sort of the family's world as well. Use literature that you have vetted, right? So literature that you have looked into carefully that will provide windows and mirrors into the children's world. And as we saw last week, that would also provide a bridge in which a child that is not necessarily portrayed in a book as identifying themselves, so the book is not necessarily going to be a mirror for them, might be a window into a different cultural background and provides a bridge between two different cultural backgrounds, the background that is portrayed in the book and the background that the child, the reader, brings into that interaction. Okay, so in order to avoid the deficit thinking, I want to show you, I want to highlight this quote. This quote is from the Otto book, and in the version of the 2015 version, it's on page 54. And this is Hart and Riley from 1995, found that increased amounts of talking provided some children with more experience with nearly every feature of language. And this, to them, showed that children of parents with a higher amount of talking had more developed competencies. In other research like this one, they have found that in families in which parents are more orally communicative, there's more talk at home, children tend to have higher levels of vocabulary. And they also tend to have, like they say here, in every feature of language. So we're looking at semantic knowledge or phonological knowledge or syntactic knowledge or morphemic knowledge, and all of those aspects of knowledge, even pragmatic knowledge, the children scored higher because the parents were more talkative at home, were more verbal folks. So when we think about children that come into our classroom and they're not necessarily very verbal, they might be coming from a household where parents aren't that talkative, or they might be coming from a cultural background where in that culture, talking is not something that happens often. It's a more quiet or silent kind of interaction that occurs at home. But that doesn't mean that the children come into the classroom with a deficit. That just means they bring in other skills that are going to be really good for you as a teacher to leverage those skills so that the child, using the skills that they already have, can continue to develop their oral and literacy, their oral language and literacy skills. So think about this is why it's really important to do these sort of initial assessments with children. And they can just be done by observing them and taking notes and collecting all these very useful observations on their development. Because you can identify in this way where children are in terms of language development and literacy development, and then from there, leverage what they already know and then keep scaffolding to continue their growth and development. But not to think about it as, oh, this is going to be really difficult because this child has not had these previous experiences, right? So instead of that approach, you can take the approach of, well, I'm going to take all the prior experiences that the child has had and leverage those to help the child then continue their development. Also, if you have a child that comes into your classroom that has a different linguistic background than English, and you might think, well, this child comes with a really big gap or a really big deficit because it's not up to par with everybody else. Well, think about all the knowledge that that child has in their native language. All of that, all those skills can be easily transferred over onto English and their English development once they have acquired some vocabulary. So vocabulary is going to be key, and this is why it's going to be very important to have classrooms in which children interact, in which children speak, in which children communicate with each other, where the teacher is communicating with the children, and there's a lot of oral language happening so that oral language can be scaffolded and supported. Okay, the next thing I wanted to show you is this video, and it's a really cool video of a research study. Deb Robb is a researcher from the MIT, and he gave a TED Talk in 2011, and that's the video that we're going to see. The video is in week 4. There's the link there so you can go see it. So we're not going to see it during this lecture, but you can see it outside of it. And it highlights or it shows us the birth of the first word his son said. They documented his son from the moment of birth to the moment he said the first word, and they show us the evolution of sound going through all the different stages of oral development until he utters that first word. And it's a really interesting video because the technology is impressive and the research skills are also impressive. And just to see him attain the word is a really interesting and just it's cool to watch. So I recommend you watch that video. Emergent literacy, we're going to touch upon this just briefly so that you have something to pull into that third column of connection to theory if your observations of your focal child have to do with literacy and not just oral language, right? So these phases that we're going to share here are a gradual development of knowledge about reading and writing. So there are some ages that are attached to some of these stages, but really it's very fluid and it's very gradual, and it's going to be very child dependent. So depending on who you're observing, you're going to see some of these phases occur earlier or later. So the first phase is observation, is when the child is observing others write and read and sort of wondering and being curious about it, but not really engaging in writing and reading him or herself yet. Phase 2 is exploration, and again, these are tentative ages, 2.5 to 4 years of age, when the child begins to explore with writing implements and with books and sort of pretends to read or pretends to write and does scribbles or does pseudo letters, and then there is a fluid stages of literacy development handout under week 4 that you can also look at. We'll talk about this more later on in the semester, but this is just to give you something to pull and be able to relate to observations that you might be making of your focal child. Then we go to phase 3, which is experimentation, that happens between pre-K and K. The children begin to draw things that are recognizable. Some start to scribble, maybe pseudo letters or letters that are identifiable to the adult. And some of them, most of them, do invented spelling, which they sound out words and they write them out in the way they think they would be written by the way they sound. And you can see all types of spelling mistakes and errors, but it's because they're sounding out the words. And that is a typical developing stage through which children go. And it's not something to be alarmed about, that invented spelling stage. Phase 4 is the communication, and it happens sort of in kindergarten and upwards, where there's a combination of invented spelling and conventional spelling. So you can see the children start writing phrases or sentences, and some words are going to be misspelled from a conventional perspective, and some words are going to be correctly spelled from that same conventional perspective. And phase 4 is when you get to conventional reading and writing, where children are capable of reading fluidly a text and writing sentences and paragraphs. And this happens around first and second grade. Okay, so if you want to know a little bit more about this, we're going to get to that later in the semester, but there's also that handout in Blackboard. These are the references we used this week. That are the references that we're using throughout the semester. And I want to highlight the homework. So complete the readings for this week. This week we have do admin slip number 2, which is on week 4's readings. We also have do your first observation of your focal child. And remember to use the observation sheet with the 3 columns that we've been using since last semester. And then there's a discussion board activity. Go in, watch the video, post your response to the prompt, and remember to comment on one of your classmates' posts. That is it for this week. I will see you again next week.